The letter that answered back. Arthur Pendleton had always believed that time was something a man could learn to live beside, if not control, then at least respect. Every year, on the morning of his birthday, he followed the same ritual. It began before sunrise, when the world was quiet, and the suburban street outside his home in a quiet corner of Boston still slept beneath a pale grey sky. Inside, the house carried its own kind of silence, not empty, not quite, just settled, like an old book that had been read many times and now rested, waiting. Arthur moved carefully through his living room, dressed in a pressed shirt and his familiar tweed jacket. His slippers whispered against the wooden floorboards. The scent of furniture polish and old paper lingered in the air. Against the far wall stood a row of clocks, mantel clocks, wall clocks, one tall grandfather clock that had once belonged to his father. Each of them marked time differently. Some ticked loudly, others barely made a sound. Arthur began there. One by one he wound them. The brass key turned with a soft resistance. A quiet mechanical heartbeat returned to each clock as it came back to life. Tick, tick, tick. He listened to them for a moment. Still here, he murmured, though whether he meant the clocks or himself was unclear. When he finished, he moved to the kitchen. The coffee-maker hissed gently, filling the room with a warm, familiar aroma. He poured himself a cup, black, just as he had for decades. Then he carried it into his study. The room was small but carefully kept. A large oak desk stood by the window, worn smooth by years of use. On it rested a leather writing pad, a stack of postcards, and a fountain pen Arthur had owned since he was 30. He sat down slowly. Outside, the first hints of autumn were visible. The maple tree in the yard had begun to turn. Just a few leaves, touched with golden red, as if the season were testing his brush before committing to the full painting. Arthur reached for the pen. He turned over the top postcard. The address was already familiar. Written so many times, it no longer required thought. Oak Creek, Vermont, his childhood home. He paused. There was always a moment before he began writing. A hesitation, like standing at the edge of something invisible. 40 years, 40 birthdays, 40 postcards sent to a house he had not lived in since he was 18. At first, it had been a simple idea, almost a joke, a way to keep track of himself, to leave a trail in case he ever needed to look back and see where he had gone wrong or right. But over time, it had become something else, a conversation, not with another person, but with the man he had been and the man he had hoped to become. Arthur lowered the pen to the card. October 12th. He always began with the date. The ink flowed smoothly, as if it remembered the path. Dear Arthur, he stopped again. The words never came quickly. Not any more. Once they had been full of plans. Ambition, certainty, now they came slower, heavier. You're 68 today. He leaned back slightly, considering. 68. The number felt both too large and strangely insignificant, as if time had not passed in years, but in quiet, unnoticed increments. The clocks are still running, he wrote, though some days I wonder if I am simply winding them out of habit. He exhaled softly. His gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the desk. His wife, Margaret. The picture had been taken decades ago. She stood in sunlight, her hair caught in a breeze, smiling at something just outside the frame. He could not remember what she had been looking at, only that she had been happy. Arthur swallowed, then continued writing. Benji visited yesterday. He fixed the computer again. I still don't understand half of what he does, but he's patient with me. You would like him. I think you would be proud. A faint smile touched his lips, then faded. I am not sure I have done enough, he wrote slowly. Or perhaps I am not sure what enough was supposed to be. The room felt quieter now, despite the ticking clocks. Arthur placed the pen down for a moment, rubbing his fingers together as if the act of writing had left something behind. He looked out the window. A single leaf drifted down from the maple tree. Time, he thought, did not rush. It simply continued. He picked up the pen again. If you are reading this, then the house still stands. That seems like something worth holding on to. He hesitated one last time, then added, Happy birthday, Arthur. He signed it with a small, steady hand. For a moment, he simply sat there, looking at the card. Then he turned it over, affixed a stamp from his carefully kept collection, and placed it neatly on the desk. Later, he would walk it to the mailbox at the end of the street, just as he always did. The ritual would be complete, and the year would begin again. Arthur leaned back in his chair, listening to the clocks. Tick, tick, tick. Time, as always, moved forward, and he, whether ready or not, moved with it. The bell above the front door chimed softly as Benji stepped inside, bringing with him a gust of crisp autumn air. Hey, Grandpa. Arthur looked up from his workbench without lifting his head entirely. A small magnifying lens was fixed over his right eye, giving him the appearance of a careful watchmaker from another century. You're late, he said, though there was no real sharpness in his voice. Benji smiled, shrugging off his jacket. Traffic, and, modern life. Arthur made a quiet sound that might have been skepticism. Modern life, he repeated as if the phrase required inspection. The workbench sat near the window in the living room, where the afternoon light fell just right. Spread across its surface were tiny tools, screwdrivers no thicker than toothpicks, delicate tweezers, a small tray holding the disassembled pieces of a pocket watch. Arthur adjusted the lens and returned his attention to the mechanism. Come see this, he said. Benji stepped closer, leaning over the table. Okay, he said carefully. I'm seeing a lot of very small things that I would definitely lose. Arthur allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. It's a Hamilton, he said. Early 1900s, good craftsmanship, worth saving. He picked up one of the gears with steady fingers. Everything in here has a purpose, he continued. Even the smallest piece. Remove one, and the whole thing stops. Benji nodded, though his eyes had already drifted towards the corner of the room where Arthur's computer sat. Speaking of things stopping, he said, your email's not syncing again. Arthur sighed, setting the gear down. I had hoped it might fix itself. That's not how computers work. That's unfortunate. Benji laughed softly and moved to the desk, waking the screen with a tap of the keyboard. Arthur watched him for a moment. There was something comforting in the way Benji moved through the world, quick, certain, unburdened by the hesitation that had settled into Arthur's own habits over the years. "Did you write it?" Benji asked, eyes still on the screen. Arthur didn't need to ask what he meant. "Yes." Benji glanced back at him. "Number 40, right?" Arthur nodded. 40, he confirmed. Benji let out a low whistle. "That's kind of amazing, you know." Arthur tilted his head slightly. "Or kind of foolish." "Why foolish?" Arthur considered the question. "I suppose," he said slowly, "because it suggests that I believed I would always have something meaningful to say." Benji turned his chair to face him. "And do you?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the pocket watch again, carefully aligning one of the gears. "I used to write about the future," he said. "Plans, expectations, things I thought would happen. And now—" Arthur paused. "Now I write about what has already happened," he said, and try to decide whether I understood it correctly. The room fell quiet. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, its tires whispering over fallen leaves. Benji studied his grandfather for a moment. "You ever think about stopping?" he asked. Arthur's hand stilled. "Stopping? Yeah, I mean, 40 years is a long time. You don't have to keep doing it." Arthur looked down at the watch in his hands. The tiny components lay open before him, waiting. "If I stop," he said quietly, "then the conversation ends." Benji frowned slightly. "Conversation with who?" Arthur glanced up. "With the only person who knows how it all began." Benji didn't respond right away. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if accepting an answer he didn't fully understand. "Fair enough," he said. He turned back to the computer, typing something quickly. A soft click echoed as Arthur closed the watch case, testing the mechanism. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, tick, tick, tick. Arthur allowed himself a small breath of satisfaction. "There," he said, "still works." Benji smiled without looking away from the screen. "Guess some things just need a little maintenance." Arthur leaned back in his chair. "Some things," he echoed. His gaze drifted once more to the photograph of Margaret. For a fleeting moment, he could almost hear her laughter, light, distant, like a sound carried on the wind. Then it was gone. The clocks continued their steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Arthur folded his hands in his lap. There had been a time when life felt like something still in motion, something unfinished. Now it felt settled, as though the important parts had already been written and what remained was simply a matter of keeping everything running. No surprises, no sudden turns, just time, moving forward, steady, predictable, certain. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. "Yes," he said, almost to himself. "I think I understand how it all works now." And for the first time in many years, that thought did not bring him comfort. The following morning arrived with a pale diffused light, that seemed to hesitate at the edges of Arthur Pendleton's quiet street, as though even the sun itself felt no urgency to begin the day. Arthur noticed it in the way one notices small deviations only after a lifetime of sameness. He stood by the kitchen window longer than usual, his coffee cooling in his hand, his gaze resting on the mailbox at the end of the path, a modest, weathered thing that had for years served as nothing more than a predictable intermediary between the outside world and the carefully ordered interior of his life. There had never been surprises in that mailbox. Bills arrived, occasional flyers, once a birthday card from a former colleague who had since stopped writing. Predictable things, manageable things. And yet, as Arthur set his cup down and reached for his coat, there was a quiet, inexplicable tension beneath his movements, as though some part of him, subconscious, unwelcome, had already sensed that something had shifted. The air outside carried that unmistakable autumn sharpness, the kind that settled into the lungs and lingered there, crisp and clean, touched faintly with the distant scent of wood smoke drifting from unseen chimneys across the neighbourhood. Arthur walked slowly down the path, his shoes brushing against fallen leaves that gave way with a dry, brittle whisper, each step sounding louder than it should have in the stillness of the morning. When he reached the mailbox, he paused, not out of habit, out of hesitation. It was such a small thing, he would later think, that moment before opening it, but it carried with it a peculiar weight, as though time itself had drawn in a breath and was waiting. Arthur opened the mailbox. Inside, among the expected envelopes, there was one that did not belong. He knew it instantly. It was not the colour, nor the size, nor even the placement that set it apart. It was something far less tangible, something that registered not in logic, but in recognition. He reached for it slowly. The paper was slightly worn, its edges softened as though it had travelled not just through distance, but through time itself. Arthur turned it over. His breath caught. The handwriting on the front was his own, not similar, not reminiscent. His, every curve of every letter, every slight pressure of the pen, every imperfection, familiar in the way one recognizes one's own reflection without needing confirmation. For a long moment he did not move. The world, in all its quiet suburban ordinariness, continued around him. Somewhere a car passed, somewhere a door closed, but Arthur stood utterly still, as though any movement might disturb the fragile, impossible reality of what he was holding. Slowly, carefully, he opened the envelope. Inside was a postcard, his postcard, last year's. He remembered it immediately, not because of the words, which had blurred over time, but because of the feeling with which he had written it, a quiet, unspoken heaviness that had lingered long after the ink had dried. Arthur turned the card over. At first he saw only what he expected, the familiar lines of his own writing, the date, the measured reflections. Then, beneath it, something else, a second layer of ink, neater, lighter, written in a hand that was not his own. Arthur's fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the card as his eyes moved across the unfamiliar words. "You were too hard on yourself in 1998. The sentence seemed to settle into the air around him, altering it, bending it, as though the very structure of his reality had been subtly, irrevocably adjusted. He swallowed. His gaze dropped to the line beneath. "Happy birthday, Arthur." There was no signature, no explanation, no indication of who had written it or how, above all, this had come to be. Arthur exhaled slowly, though he did not remember holding his breath. The world returned, but not as it had been. The leaves still rustled, the air still carried its autumn chill, but everything now existed with a faint, disquieting distortion, as though the familiar had been overlaid with something unknowable. Arthur looked down once more at the postcard in his hands. For 40 years he had written into silence. For 40 years there had been no reply. And now, impossibly, someone had answered. Arthur did not sleep well that night, though he could not have said precisely when wakefulness gave way to something resembling rest, or whether it ever truly had. The postcard lay on his desk, placed with a care that bordered on reverence, as though it were not merely an object, but a fragile piece of evidence in a case whose implications he had not yet begun to comprehend. Morning came slowly, reluctantly, and Arthur met it with a mind already in motion. If there was one thing he had retained from his years as a history teacher, it was this: extraordinary claims required careful examination, and every anomaly, no matter how unsettling, could, in theory, be understood. He sat at his desk, the postcard before him, and reached for the magnifying glass he had used countless times to examine the intricate mechanisms of antique watches. Now it would serve a different purpose. Arthur adjusted the angle of the desk lamp, bringing the light down in a focus beam, and leaned closer. Through the lens the ink revealed its secrets. His own handwriting appeared as he expected, slightly heavier, the strokes confident but measured, the result of decades of repetition. The second handwriting, however, told a different story. It was lighter, more fluid. There was a subtle elegance to it, a careful precision that suggested not haste, but intention. Arthur shifted the card slightly, examining the intersection where the two inks met. No smudging, no hesitation. The response had not been added carelessly. It had been written with deliberation, as though the writer had understood exactly where their words belonged. Arthur leaned back, removing the lens. "This is not a coincidence," he murmured, though the statement felt insufficient, almost naive in the face of what he was confronting. A soft knock sounded at the door. Before Arthur could respond, it opened slightly, and Benji stepped inside, carrying his usual energy with him. "Hey," he said, then paused, immediately sensing the shift in the room. "Okay, something's different." Arthur gestured toward the desk. "Come here." Benji approached, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion as Arthur handed him the postcard. For several seconds he said nothing. Then, "Wait," he said slowly, turning the card over in his hands. "This is yours, right?" "Yes." "And this part," he pointed to the added writing, "this isn't." "No." Benji looked up. "Okay," he said, exhaling a short, incredulous breath. "That's not normal." Arthur almost smiled at the understatement. "Look at the postmark," Arthur said. Benji leaned closer, squinting slightly. "Oak Creek, Vermont," he read. "Dated 3 days ago." Arthur nodded. "I sent that postcard a year ago." Benji straightened, running a hand through his hair. "So, someone got it, kept it, and then sent it back?" With a response, Arthur added, "Yeah," Benji said, glancing again at the message. "A very specific response." Arthur folded his hands together. "For 40 years," he said, "those postcards have gone to the same address." Benji's eyes sharpened slightly. "You think whoever lives there now found them?" Arthur did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the edge of the desk, his fingers resting lightly against the wood as though grounding himself in something solid. "It is the only explanation that does not require abandoning reason entirely." Benji nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Then we find out who lives there." Arthur looked at him. "How?" Benji's expression shifted into something more familiar. "Focused, capable. Give me 5 minutes," he said, already moving toward the computer. Arthur watched as his grandson sat down, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, navigating a world that, to Arthur, still felt abstract and distant. For a few moments, the only sound in the room was the quiet tapping of keys, accompanied by the steady ticking of the clocks. Tick, tick, tick. Then, "Got it," Benji said. Arthur leaned forward slightly. "Well?" Benji turned the screen toward him. "Property records," he said. "House in Oak Creek. Current owner, Eleanor Vance." The name lingered in the air, unfamiliar and yet suddenly profoundly important. Arthur repeated it quietly. "Eleanor Vance." Benji glanced back at the postcard. "You think she wrote it?" Arthur looked down at the delicate, precise handwriting. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I believe she did." Silence settled between them, though it felt different now, not empty, but charged as though something had been set into motion that could not easily be undone. Benji broke it first. "So, what are you going to do?" Arthur did not hesitate. For the first time since the letter had arrived, something within him had shifted, not into fear, but into clarity. He stood, reaching for his coat. "I'm going to ask her," he said. Benji blinked. "You mean go there?" Arthur met his gaze. "Yes." Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, sending a scattering of golden leaves across the yard. For 40 years, Arthur had written to the past. Now, for the first time, the past had answered, and he intended to answer back. Arthur Pendleton had not taken a long drive in years, not the kind of drive that stretched beyond errands and obligations, beyond the quiet perimeter of his Privichny Zhizny in a suburb of Boston, and into something uncertain, something unplanned, something that required not just movement, but intention. And yet, on that particular morning, as the pale gold light of early autumn settled gently over the rooftops and filtered through the thinning canopy of trees, he found himself standing beside his old Ford station wagon, one hand resting on the cool metal of its door, as though confirming that both he and the car were in fact still capable of such a journey. The engine started with a low, familiar rumble, steady, dependable, reassuring in a way that modern things rarely were. And as Arthur eased the car out onto the quiet street, he felt, for the first time in a very long while, that subtle but unmistakable sensation of stepping outside the boundaries of a life that had grown, perhaps too orderly, too contained. The road unfolded before him gradually, first through the subdued familiarity of suburban streets, then through wider roads edged with trees that had begun to surrender themselves to the season, their leaves shifting from green into brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold, as though the land itself were quietly, magnificently letting go. Arthur drove without music. He preferred it that way. The soft hum of the engine, the rhythmic passing of road markings beneath the tires, and the occasional whisper of wind against the windows formed a kind of understated symphony, one that allowed his thoughts to move freely, unstructured, unhurried. It had been decades since he had last travelled this route, and yet, as the miles passed and the landscape gradually transformed into the unmistakable character of New England countryside, rolling hills, weathered barns, narrow roads framed by stone walls that seemed older than memory itself, something within him began to stir, not quite recognition, but something adjacent to it, a familiarity that did not belong to the present, a memory that had not yet fully surfaced. He stopped once at a small roadside diner whose faded sign leaned slightly as though tired from years of standing watch over passing travellers, and where the air inside carried the comforting scent of coffee that had been poured endlessly into thick ceramic mugs, alongside the faint sweetness of pie cooling somewhere just out of sight. Arthur sat by the window, his hands wrapped loosely around his cup, watching as a few leaves drifted past in the quiet afternoon breeze, their descent unhurried, almost deliberate, as though even gravity had softened under the influence of the season. He thought briefly about turning back. The thought came not as fear, but as habit, the quiet voice of routine reminding him that his life, as it had been, required no disruption, no unanswered questions, no sudden detours into uncertainty. And yet, just as quickly as the thought arose, it faded, because something else had taken its place, not curiosity, not even obligation, but something quieter, deeper, a sense that this unexpected journey, this interruption of routine, was not an intrusion, but an invitation. Arthur finished his coffee, left a few bills on the table, and stepped back into the crisp afternoon air, where the sky had cleared into a soft, endless blue that stretched above the landscape like a promise not yet fully understood. The final stretch of the drive led him into the small town of Oak Creek, nestled quietly within the gentle folds of Vermont, where time seemed not to have stopped, but rather to have chosen a slower, more deliberate pace. The streets were lined with modest houses, their porches adorned with seasonal wreaths and the occasional rocking chair, while trees, now fully transformed into brilliant shades of autumn, stood like silent witnesses to the passage of countless years. Arthur slowed the car as he turned onto a familiar road. His grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. There it was, the house, smaller than he remembered, and yet unmistakably the same, the wooden siding, weathered but intact, the front steps slightly uneven, the large window facing the yard, the very window beneath which, unbeknownst to him for decades, his postcards had gathered in quiet, patient accumulation. Arthur brought the car to a stop at the edge of the road. For a long moment he did not move. The engine idled softly as though waiting for instruction. Arthur looked at the house, not as it was, but as it had been, layered invisibly beneath the present, filled with echoes of voices, footsteps, laughter that no longer belonged to the world he inhabited. 40 years, 40 letters, and now an answer. He turned off the engine. The silence that followed was not empty. It was expectant. Arthur opened the door, stepped out, and closed it gently behind him. The leaves beneath his feet whispered as he began to walk toward the house. Arthur noticed her before she noticed him. She stood in the garden just to the right of the house, partially framed by a wooden fence and surrounded by rose bushes that, despite the advancing season, still held a surprising number of late blooms, soft pinks and deep reds that seemed to glow against the muted gold of the surrounding landscape. She moved with quiet focus, her hands steady as she trimmed a branch with careful precision, as though the act of tending the garden required not just attention, but a kind of respect. For a moment, Arthur simply watched. There was something in the scene that felt unexpectedly complete, not in the sense of finality, but in the sense of belonging, as though the house, which had once belonged to his past, had found its way into a present that did not erase it, but carried it forward in a different form. The woman straightened slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face, and it was then that she noticed him standing at the edge of the yard, uncertain, perhaps, of how to bridge the distance between memory and reality. Their eyes met. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. Then she offered a small warm smile, the kind that did not demand explanation, but made space for it. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm, carrying easily through the still air. Arthur hesitated, not because he did not know why he was there, but because the act of saying it aloud would transform something abstract into something undeniably real. "Yes," he said finally, taking a step forward. I believe this used to be my house." The words felt strange as they left him, as though they belonged to someone else. The woman's expression shifted, not into surprise, but into something more thoughtful, more attentive. "I see," she said, setting the pruning shears aside. "That would make you Arthur." Arthur blinked. "Yes," he said, unable to hide the slight confusion in his voice. "It would." She nodded, as though confirming something she had already known. "I was wondering when you might come," she said. The sentence settled between them with quiet significance. Arthur reached into his coat pocket, his fingers closing around the postcard that had brought him there, and for a brief moment he felt again that same sense of unreality that had accompanied its arrival. He stepped closer, holding it out. "This," he said, "was sent to me." She took the card gently, her eyes moving across the familiar words, then pausing at the line she had added. When she looked up again, There was no hesitation in her expression. "Yes," she said simply, "I wrote that." Arthur exhaled slowly, as though some part of him had still expected denial, or confusion, or anything other than this quiet certainty. "I don't understand," he said. She smiled, not dismissively, but with a kind of patient warmth that suggested understanding did not always need to arrive all at once. "Of course you don't," she said. "That would make this much less interesting." Arthur found himself almost smiling in return, despite the lingering confusion that still framed the moment. She gestured toward the house. "Would you like to come up?" she asked. "It's a bit chilly to stand out here, and I've just taken a pie out of the oven." Arthur glanced briefly at the porch, at the door he had not crossed in decades, at the space that existed now both as memory and as present reality. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said quietly, "I think I would." They walked together toward the house, the wooden steps creaking softly beneath their weight, the sound familiar in a way that felt almost impossible after so many years. As they reached the porch, the warm, unmistakable scent of cinnamon and baked apples drifted outward, wrapping itself around the moment with a kind of gentle inevitability. Inside the house was both changed and unchanged, furnished differently, arranged with another person's life, and yet carrying beneath it all the subtle, persistent echoes of what had come before. She led him into the kitchen, where a freshly baked pie rested on the counter, its golden crust still releasing faint wisps of steam into the air. "I'm Eleanor Vance," she said, reaching for 2 mugs, "and I have been meaning to meet you for quite some time." Arthur stood there for a moment, taking in the warmth of the room, the quiet certainty in her voice, the strange and unexpected sense that, somehow, this meeting had not happened by accident. "Arthur Pendleton," he replied, though it felt unnecessary. Eleanor smiled as she poured the coffee. "Yes," she said softly, "I know." If Arthur Pendleton had expected revelation to arrive in some grand, unmistakable form, something dramatic, something that would announce itself with clarity and finality, then what he encountered instead was almost disarmingly ordinary, and yet, precisely because of that, profoundly unsettling. Eleanor Vance did not rush. After pouring the coffee and allowing Arthur a moment to settle into the quiet warmth of the kitchen, a warmth that seemed to gather not only in the air, but in the walls themselves, in the soft creak of the floorboards and the lingering scent of cinnamon, she simply said, with a calm that suggested this was a continuation rather than a beginning, "I think you should see something." There was no urgency in her tone, no attempt to prepare him, and perhaps it was that absence of drama that made Arthur's pulse quicken slightly as he followed her through the narrow hallway, past rooms that felt both unfamiliar and intimately known, as though memory and reality were overlapping imperfectly, creating a subtle, persistent dissonance. The staircase leading to the attic was steeper than he remembered, or perhaps he was simply more aware of each step now, more conscious of the quiet strain in his knees, the way his hand instinctively sought the railing, not out of necessity, but out of habit, out of an awareness of time that had not existed when he was young. Eleanor moved ahead of him with steady ease, carrying a small lantern despite the daylight, as though she understood that what awaited them above required not just light, but intention. When she pushed open the attic door, the hinges released a soft, prolonged creak that seemed less like a sound and more like a memory being disturbed. The space beyond was dim, filled with the faint, dry scent of wood and dust, and illuminated only by the thin beams of sunlight filtering through a small window at the far end, where particles of dust drifted lazily in the air, suspended between movement and stillness. Arthur stepped inside slowly. The attic had always been a place of forgotten things, boxes, old furniture, objects that had once held meaning but had gradually been set aside as life moved forward. And yet, standing there now, he felt not the weight of abandonment, but something closer to preservation, as though time had not erased what had been left here, but had simply waited. Eleanor crossed the room without hesitation, her steps careful but certain, and stopped near the window, the very window Arthur remembered from his childhood, beneath which he had once sat on rainy afternoons, listening to the soft rhythm of water against the glass. She knelt down. "For years," she said quietly, running her fingers along the baseboard, "I thought this house was simply old, full of the usual quirks, drafts, uneven floors, the occasional unexplained noise." Arthur watched her, his attention narrowing, focusing not on her words, but on her hands, as they pressed gently against a narrow seam in the wood. "It wasn't until I started renovating," she continued, "that I realized something didn't quite add up." With a subtle motion, she pulled at a small section of the baseboard. It shifted, not dramatically, just enough. A thin opening revealed itself, a narrow hidden gap between the wall and the floor, so inconspicuous that it could easily have gone unnoticed for decades. Arthur felt something tighten in his chest. Eleanor reached inside. For a moment there was only the faint sound of her hand moving against unseen surfaces. Then she drew out a box, a simple shoebox, worn at the edges, its lid slightly bowed with age, as though it had been quietly bearing the weight of time. She placed it gently on the floor between them. Arthur did not move. He did not need to, because even before the lid was lifted he knew. Eleanor looked up at him, her expression soft, not with sympathy, but with understanding, the kind that did not intrude, but simply acknowledged. "I didn't open them at first," she said. "It didn't feel right." Arthur nodded, though he had not yet found the words to speak. "But eventually," she continued, "I realized they weren't lost. They were waiting." She lifted the lid. Inside, postcards, dozens of them, stacked carefully, each one aligned with quiet precision, their edges worn, their colours faded slightly with time, and yet unmistakably preserved, as though the years had touched them but had not claimed them. Arthur lowered himself slowly to his knees. His hands hovered above the box, uncertain, as though the act of touching them might alter something irreversibly. 39, Eleanor said softly, "before the one I sent back." Arthur's fingers finally made contact with the top card. The paper felt familiar, not just in texture, but in presence, as though it carried within it not only ink, but intention, time, memory, 40 years of a life he had attempted in fragments to understand. He picked one up, then another, each one a message sent into silence, each one a voice that had never expected to be heard. Until now, Arthur exhaled, though the breath felt incomplete, as though something within him had shifted in a way he could not yet name. "They were never delivered," he said quietly. Eleanor shook her head gently. "No," she said, "but they weren't lost either." Arthur looked at the box again, at the accumulation of years gathered in one place, hidden in the walls of a house that had outlived versions of both of them. For the first time in a very long while, the past did not feel distant. It felt present, waiting. They chose the living room without discussing it, as though both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that what they were about to do required not just space, but a certain kind of stillness, a quiet that could hold not only words, but the weight behind them. The box rested on the coffee table between them, its contents now no longer hidden, no longer abstract, but undeniably real. Arthur sat in an armchair near the window, where the late afternoon light filtered through in long golden strands that stretched across the floor and touched the edges of the postcards, illuminating them in a way that felt almost intentional, as though the light itself had chosen to participate. Eleanor sat opposite him, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her posture relaxed but attentive, not as an observer, but as someone prepared to witness. Arthur reached for the first card, not the earliest, not yet. Instead, one from somewhere in the middle, chosen not by logic, but by instinct, as though some part of him already knew where to begin. He turned it over. The handwriting was unmistakably his, though younger, slightly sharper, less measured, carrying a kind of forward momentum that he could now recognize as certainty. He read silently at first, then, after a moment, aloud. His voice was steady, though quieter than before, as though the act of speaking the words required not projection, but care. "October 12th, he began. The date lingered briefly in the air. "You are 32 today. Margaret says you worry too much about the future. She's probably right. The baby is due in the spring. I don't think I've ever been this afraid of something that feels this important." Arthur stopped, not because he had reached the end, but because the words themselves had reached him. Eleanor did not interrupt. She did not need to. Arthur continued, his voice softer now. "If you're reading this years from now, I hope you remember this feeling. Not the fear, but the anticipation. The sense that everything is about to change." He lowered the card slightly. For a moment the room held only silence. Then Eleanor spoke, her voice gentle but certain. "You were going to be a father," she said. Arthur nodded. "Yes." There was no elaboration. There did not need to be. He set the card down and reached for another. This one was heavier, not in weight, but in tone, a difference he recognized immediately, even before reading the first line. "October 12th, he read again. The repetition felt different now, not routine but rhythm. "You are 46 today. Margaret is gone." I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do with the quiet. The house feels too large now. I keep expecting to hear her in the kitchen or in the hallway or anywhere that isn't here. His voice faltered just slightly. Eleanor leaned forward, not intrusively, but with a quiet attentiveness that seemed to say, I'm here. You can continue. Arthur did. People say time helps. I don't think they understand that time is the problem. It keeps moving, whether you are ready or not. He stopped again, this time placing the card down more deliberately, as though acknowledging not just the words, but the man who had written them. Eleanor exhaled softly. That's a very honest sentence, she said. Arthur gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It felt true, he said. It still does. Arthur considered the question. The light had shifted slightly, growing warmer, softer, as the day moved quietly toward evening. Less than it did, he said after a moment, but not entirely gone. Eleanor accepted the answer without comment, her silence again offering space rather than resolution. They continued, card after card, year after year, moments layered upon moments, birthdays marked not by celebration, but by reflection, by attempts to understand a life that had unfolded in ways both expected and unforeseen. There were mentions of his daughter, her first steps, her departure for college, the distance that had grown between them in ways he had never fully explained, even to himself. There were references to the world beyond him, events, changes, the subtle ways in which time had altered not only his life, but the world in which it existed. And throughout it all, there was a consistent thread, a voice, his voice, searching, questioning, trying always to make sense of something that did not easily yield to understanding. At some point, Arthur realized that Eleanor was not merely listening. She was reading him, not in the sense of analysis, but in recognition, as though the fragments he had written, scattered across decades, had formed a narrative she could see more clearly than he could himself. You've been documenting your life, she said at one point, her voice thoughtful. Not just recording it, interpreting it. Arthur looked at her. I thought I was just keeping track, he said. Eleanor shook her head gently. No, she said. You were trying to understand who you were becoming. The sentence settled into him with quiet precision. Arthur looked down at the remaining cards. So many of them, so many attempts. And yet, for the first time, sitting there in a room that had once belonged to his past and now held his present in an entirely unexpected way, he felt something shift. Not clarity, not yet, but the possibility of it, and beside him, across from him, was someone who had not lived those years, but who somehow understood them. Not because she had been there, but because she had been willing to listen. And in that quiet, shared space, Arthur Pendleton began, slowly, to see his own life not as a series of disconnected moments, but as something continuous, something that, perhaps, was still being written. It was not a single moment that brought Arthur Pendleton and Eleanor Vance closer together, nor a dramatic confession or sudden realization, but rather a gradual and almost imperceptible unfolding, like the slow turning of leaves in the quiet countryside of Vermont, in which conversation gave way to understanding, and understanding in turn began to resemble something far more enduring. The house, which had at first seemed to Arthur like a preserved fragment of his past, gradually revealed itself as something more dynamic, more alive, transformed not only by time but by the presence of the woman who now moved through its rooms with a quiet confidence that suggested she did not merely inhabit it but listen to it. It began with the clock. Eleanor mentioned it almost casually, as though it were an afterthought, though Arthur would later realize that very little about her manner was accidental. "There's something wrong with the grandfather clock in the hallway," she said, glancing toward the narrow passage that connected the living room to the rest of the house. "It hasn't been keeping time properly, and I suspect it's trying to tell me something I don't quite understand." Arthur followed her, drawn less by the problem itself than by the familiar comfort of something mechanical, something that obeyed laws he could trust. The clock stood tall against the wall, its wooden case worn but dignified, its pendulum visible through the glass, though at the moment it hung still, as though suspended in hesitation rather than motion. Arthur opened the case with gentle precision, his fingers instinctively adjusting to the task, as though the years between this moment and the countless hours he had spent restoring similar mechanisms had simply folded in on themselves. "Clocks don't speak," he said quietly, examining the gears within. "They respond." Eleanor leaned lightly against the wall, watching him, not with impatience, but with a kind of attentive curiosity that suggested she was less interested in the clock itself than in the way Arthur interacted with it. "And what are they responding to?" she asked. Arthur did not answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted a small component, tested the tension of the spring, and set the pendulum into motion with a careful, deliberate push. Tick. The sound returned, tentative at first, then steady. Tick, tick. "Time," he said finally, "or perhaps the way we treat it." Eleanor smiled faintly, as though the answer had confirmed something she had already suspected. "I used to work in archives," she said after a moment, her voice carrying a reflective softness that seemed to belong to another time. "People think it's about preserving documents, but it's not. It's about preserving context, understanding how one life connects to another, how choices ripple outward in ways we rarely see while we're living them." Arthur straightened, closing the clock case with quiet care. "And do they?" he asked. "Connect, I mean?" Eleanor met his gaze. "Always," she said, "even when we pretend they don't." The words lingered between them, not as a challenge, but as an invitation, one that Arthur did not immediately accept, but did not dismiss either. They moved back into the living room, where the fading light of the afternoon had softened into something warmer, more intimate, as though the house itself were settling into the quiet companionship that had begun to take shape within its walls. Conversation came more easily now, not because there was less to say, but because neither of them felt the need to say everything at once. Arthur spoke of his years as a teacher, of the way history had once seemed like a fixed narrative until he realized that it was, in fact, a collection of perspectives, each one incomplete, each one shaped by the person telling it. Eleanor listened, then responded not with contradiction, but with expansion, offering her own experiences of tracing family histories, of uncovering stories that had been forgotten or deliberately hidden, and of the strange, almost humbling realization that no life existed in isolation. And yet, Arthur said at one point, his voice thoughtful, we spend so much of it believing that our experiences are entirely our own. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Perhaps they are, she said, but the meaning we give them rarely is. Arthur considered that. Outside, the light continued to fade, the sky shifting into deeper shades of blue and grey, while the first hints of evening settled gently over the quiet town. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, Arthur did not feel the familiar pull of routine urging him toward departure, toward the safety of what he already understood. Instead, he remained, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because, unexpectedly, he had found somewhere he wanted to stay. It was later, after the light had fully surrendered to evening, and the house had grown quieter, not with absence, but with a kind of settled calm, that Arthur finally asked the question that had, until then, remained suspended just beyond the edge of their conversation. Eleanor had lit a small lamp in the living room, its warm glow casting soft shadows along the walls, while the faint sound of the now repaired clock in the hallway marked the passage of time with a steady, reassuring rhythm that seemed almost deliberately placed. Arthur sat with his hands loosely folded, his gaze resting not on Eleanor, but on the box of postcards that remained on the table between them, as though the answer he sought might still be found there, hidden somewhere among the fragments of his own past. "Why did you write back?" he asked at last, his voice calm, though beneath it lay a quiet insistence that could not be mistaken. Eleanor did not respond immediately. Instead, she took a slow breath, her eyes moving briefly toward the window where the darkness outside reflected faintly against the glass, creating a subtle illusion of depth that seemed to mirror the moment itself. "I didn't intend to," she said finally. Arthur looked up. "What changed?" he asked. Eleanor leaned back slightly, her hands resting in her lap, her expression thoughtful, not searching for an answer, but choosing how best to give it. "It was the last postcard," she said, "the one from last year." Arthur felt something shift within him, though he did not yet understand why. "I read many of them," she continued, carefully, respectfully. "I wanted to understand the voice behind them, the person who had been writing all these years without expecting a reply." Arthur's gaze dropped briefly, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. "And I thought," she went on, "that what you were doing was remarkable, not because it was unusual, but because it was honest. You weren't trying to impress anyone, you were trying to understand yourself." She paused, allowing the words to settle. "But the last one," she said more quietly, "was different." Arthur did not speak. He did not need to, because Even before she continued, he remembered, not the exact words, but the feeling. "I could hear it," Eleanor said, "between the lines, a kind of finality, as though you had begun to believe that your story had already reached its conclusion." Arthur's hands tightened slightly. "I wrote what I felt," he said. "I know," she replied gently, "and that's exactly why I couldn't ignore it." The clock in the hallway continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but unwavering. "As an archivist," she said, "I've spent my life preserving stories, protecting them from being lost, from being misunderstood, from ending before they've truly been told." Arthur met her gaze. "And you thought mine was ending?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head. "No," she said, "I thought you were deciding that it had already ended." The distinction, though subtle, landed with unexpected clarity. Arthur exhaled slowly, the breath carrying with it something he hadn't realized he had been holding. "I didn't think anyone would read them," he said. "I know," Eleanor replied, "and that's why I did." The simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have. Arthur looked again at the postcards, at the years he had spent speaking into silence, unaware that those words had been gathering, waiting, forming a narrative that had, at last, been seen. "And the message?" he asked after a moment. "About 1998. Eleanor's expression softened further, though there was now a quiet certainty within it. "That wasn't random," she said. "That was the year you wrote with the most regret." Arthur's breath caught, almost imperceptibly. "You blamed yourself," she continued, "more than once, for something you couldn't change." Arthur looked away. The room seemed smaller now, not in space, but in focus, as though everything unnecessary had fallen away, leaving only what mattered. "I've had a lot of time to think about that year," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. "I could tell." There was no judgment in her voice, only understanding. "And I thought," she added, "that perhaps what you needed wasn't more time." Arthur looked back at her. "But a response," she said. The word lingered, simple, unadorned, and yet, in that moment, it felt as though it carried the weight of something far greater than itself. Arthur leaned back slowly, his gaze drifting once more to the window, where the darkness remained steady, unchanged, and yet no longer quite as impenetrable as it had seemed before. For 40 years he had ridden to the past, not expecting an answer, not even imagining one, and yet, now that it had come, he understood something he had not allowed himself to consider, that perhaps time did not only move forward, perhaps in quiet and unexpected ways it also listened. There are years in a person's life that pass quietly, almost indistinguishably from one another, blending into a soft continuum of routines and obligations. And then there are years that remain, sharp, immovable, etched into memory with such clarity that no passage of time can fully soften their edges. For Arthur Pendleton, 1998 was one of those years. He had not spoken of it in detail for a long time, not because the memory had faded, but because it had not. because it remained as present as the ticking of the clocks that surrounded him, steady and inescapable, marking not only time, but the distance between who he had been and who he had become. The house was quiet again, though it no longer carried the same stillness it had before. Now the silence felt shared, inhabited by two people who understood, perhaps without fully articulating it, that what was about to be said would not be simple and would not be easily undone. Arthur stood near the window, his hands resting lightly against the back of a chair, as though anchoring himself to something tangible, while he searched for a way to give shape to something that had resisted clarity for decades. "I had an argument with my daughter," he began, his voice measured, though beneath it there was a tension that suggested the words had been waiting, not for the right moment, but for the right listener. Eleanor did not interrupt. She did not shift or lean forward or offer reassurance. She simply remained where she was, her presence steady, her attention complete. Arthur continued. "It wasn't unusual, at least not at first," he said. "Parents and children disagree. It's expected, almost, a kind of friction that signals change." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the faint reflection in the window, where his own image appeared slightly blurred, as though time itself had softened the details. "But this was different," he said quietly, "because I wasn't listening." The admission settled into the room with a quiet weight. "I thought I was right," he continued, a faint, almost ironic smile touching his lips, which, in retrospect, is often the clearest indication that one is not. Eleanor's expression remained calm, though there was now a subtle warmth in it, not approval, not agreement, but recognition. "She wanted to leave," Arthur said, "not just for college, but beyond that, a different city, a different life, one that didn't revolve around what I thought was best for her." He exhaled slowly. "And I couldn't accept that," he added. "I told myself it was concern, responsibility, but it wasn't. It was control." The word lingered, clear, unavoidable. "I said things," Arthur continued, his voice quieter now, "that I believed would make her reconsider. Things I thought would bring her back." He shook his head slightly. "They didn't," he said. "They pushed her away." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of memory, of regret, of the unspoken understanding that some moments, once past, cannot be revisited in the way one might wish. "She left," Arthur said after a moment, "and for a long time that was the last real conversation we had." Eleanor shifted slightly, though her voice, when she spoke, remained soft and measured. "And you've carried that with you?" she said. It was not a question. Arthur nodded. "In every letter," he said, "in ways I didn't always recognize at the time." Eleanor considered this, her gaze thoughtful, as though she were tracing the outline of something that had existed long before she had encountered it. "May I ask you something?" she said. Arthur turned slightly toward her. "Yes." "If you had written to her," Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully, "the way you wrote to yourself, do you think things might have been different?" Arthur did not answer immediately. The question did not invite a simple response, and he seemed to understand that. Instead, he moved slowly to the chair and sat down, his hands resting in his lap, his posture no longer guarded, but open in a way that suggested he was, for the first time, allowing himself to consider not only what had happened, but what might have been possible. "I don't know," he said at last. Eleanor nodded, accepting the uncertainty. "But I do know this," she continued. "The man who wrote those letters, the man who questioned himself, who reflected, who tried to understand, that man was already changing." Arthur looked at her, something in her words catching his attention. "You don't become that person overnight," she added, "and you don't become him by accident." Arthur exhaled slowly, the breath carrying with it a subtle shift, not resolution, not forgiveness, but the beginning of something adjacent to it. "I thought I had to be certain," he said, "that I had to know what was right." Eleanor smiled gently. "Certainty is often just fear in a more convincing form," she said. Arthur considered that, the idea settling into place with a quiet precision that felt both unfamiliar and undeniably true. "And what about now?" she asked after a moment. Arthur hesitated, then, "I don't know if she would want to hear from me," he said. Eleanor's expression softened, though her voice remained steady. "That may be true," she said, "but not knowing is not the same as knowing she wouldn't." Arthur looked down at his hands. For years he had ridden to the past, attempting to understand it, to interpret it, to assign meaning to moments that no longer existed except in memory. And yet, sitting there now, he realized that perhaps the past was not the only place where understanding could be sought. Perhaps there was still something that could be said. The decision to leave did not arrive suddenly, nor did it present itself as a clear, decisive thought. Rather, it emerged gradually, almost imperceptibly, as a quiet tightening within Arthur Pendleton, a subtle retreat from the openness that had, for a brief and unexpected time, allowed him to step beyond the carefully constructed boundaries of his solitary life. It was not that he regretted what had been said. On the contrary, there was a part of him that recognized with an almost uncomfortable clarity that the conversation he had shared with Eleanor had been more honest, more revealing than anything he had allowed himself in years, and that perhaps was precisely the problem. Vulnerability, Arthur realized, was not something one simply embraced without consequence. It unsettled, it disrupted, it introduced uncertainty into spaces that had, for a long time, been governed by predictability. He stood in the hallway, his coat draped over his arm, listening for a moment to the steady, familiar ticking of the grandfather clock he had repaired, as though seeking reassurance in its rhythm, in the quiet, mechanical certainty that something at least continued to function as expected. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her presence as calm as it had been from the moment he had arrived, though there was now perhaps a deeper awareness in her gaze, a recognition that something within Arthur had shifted, not forward, but inward. "You're leaving," she said, again not a question. Arthur nodded. "Yes," he replied, his voice composed, though there was a faint hesitation beneath it that he did not fully conceal. "I think I should." Eleanor studied him for a moment, not with disappointment, not with resistance, but with a kind of quiet understanding that suggested she had anticipated this possibility long before it had taken shape. "Of course," she said gently. There was no attempt to stop him, no argument, no appeal, and somehow that made the moment more difficult, not less. Arthur adjusted his coat slightly, his movements deliberate, as though he were reassembling something within himself, restoring a sense of order that had been briefly but undeniably disrupted. "I appreciate your kindness," he said, the word feeling insufficient, though he could not immediately find a better one. Eleanor smiled, a soft, almost knowing expression that seemed to acknowledge both the gratitude and the limitations of language. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "You came all this way. That matters." Arthur inclined his head slightly, accepting the statement without fully understanding it. They walked together to the door, the floorboards creaking softly beneath their steps, each sound carrying a familiarity that now felt layered with something new, something that had not been there before and might not easily be forgotten. At the threshold, Arthur paused. Not long, just enough. Eleanor reached toward the small table near the door and picked up a jar. Homemade apple jam, its deep amber color catching the light from the nearby window, the glass warm from the kitchen where it had been prepared. She held it out to him. "For the road," she said. Arthur accepted it, his fingers brushing briefly against hers, the contact light, but unmistakable. "Thank you," he said. Eleanor's gaze remained steady. "Time doesn't go backward, Arthur," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying a clarity that seemed to extend beyond the words themselves. "But it can be wound again." The phrase lingered, not as advice, not as instruction, but as something closer to an offering. Arthur looked at the jar in his hands, then back at her. For a moment it seemed as though he might say something more, something that would acknowledge the significance of what had passed between them, something that would bridge the distance he was already beginning to recreate. But he did not. Instead, he nodded once, turned, and stepped out onto the porch where the air had grown cooler, the light softer, the evening settling gently over the quiet town. He descended the steps slowly, the leaves beneath his feet shifting with a soft, familiar sound, and made his way toward the car that waited at the edge of the road, unchanged, dependable, ready to carry him back to the life he understood. Behind him, the door closed quietly. Arthur did not turn around, not because he did not want to, but because he was not yet certain what he would see if he did. He placed the jar carefully on the passenger seat, started the engine, and sat for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed ahead. The road back was clear, familiar, predictable, and yet, as he pulled away, leaving the house behind, he carried with him something that did not fit neatly into that familiarity, something unresolved, something that, despite his best efforts, refused to remain in the past, and for the first time in many years, Arthur Pendleton felt not the comfort of certainty, but the quiet, persistent pull of something unfinished. The return to his home in the quiet suburbs of Boston did not feel like a restoration of order, as Arthur Pendleton had expected it might, but rather like stepping back into a space that, while unchanged in its physical form, no longer aligned as neatly with the internal structure he had relied upon for so many years. The house greeted him with its familiar stillness, the clocks ticking in their steady, measured rhythm, the faint scent of old wood and paper lingering in the air. But beneath that familiarity there was now a subtle dissonance, as though something essential had shifted and the life he had once understood so completely had begun, quietly but persistently, to ask more of him than routine alone could answer. He placed the jar of apple jam on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, his hand resting lightly against the cool surface, his gaze unfocused, not because he was thinking of nothing, but because he was thinking of too much. The journey, the house, the attic, the letters, Eleanor. Each memory existed now not as a sequence, but as a presence, and that presence did not recede, it remained. The sound of the doorbell came as a gentle interruption, though it did not startle him. Instead, it felt almost expected, as though the next part of the story had already been set into motion before he had fully caught up with the previous one. Arthur opened the door to find Benji standing there, his expression immediately shifting into curiosity as he took in his grandfather's appearance, the slightly distant gaze, the subtle fatigue, the unmistakable signs of someone who had returned from more than just a drive. "Well," Benji said, stepping inside, "that was either a very long trip or a very important one." Arthur allowed himself a faint smile. "It may have been both," he replied. Benji shrugged off his jacket and glanced toward the kitchen, where the jar of jam caught his attention almost immediately. "What's that?" he asked, picking it up and examining it with mild fascination. "This doesn't look like something you usually bring home." "It was a gift," Arthur said. Benji raised an eyebrow. "From the mystery pen pal?" Arthur hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Benji leaned against the counter, clearly intrigued. "Okay," he said, "you're going to have to tell me everything." Arthur did not sit immediately. Instead, he moved slowly into the living room, his gaze drifting across the familiar arrangement of objects, each one precisely where it had always been, each one part of a life that had, until recently, required no explanation. Then, with a quiet exhale, he began. He spoke of the drive, of the house, of the attic, of the box of postcards that had, for 40 years, existed unseen yet preserved, as though time itself had been waiting for the moment they would be discovered. He spoke of Eleanor, not in grand descriptions, but in careful, deliberate observations, the kind that revealed not only what he had seen, but what he had understood. And as he spoke, Benji listened, not with the distracted patience of youth, but with a genuine attentiveness that suggested he recognized, perhaps instinctively, that what he was hearing was not merely a story, but a turning point. When Arthur finished, The room fell into a thoughtful silence. Benji considered everything for a moment, then said simply, "She sounds amazing." Arthur let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "She is perceptive," he said. Benji studied him. "You're different," he said after a moment. Arthur looked at him. "In what way?" Benji shrugged, though his gaze remained steady. "I don't know exactly," he admitted, "just less certain, but in a good way." Arthur considered that, the observation settling into him with a quiet resonance. Less certain, and yet somehow more aware. Benji set the jar of jam back on the counter. "So what now?" he asked. Arthur did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the small table near the window, where his phone rested, an object he had for years used sparingly, almost reluctantly. He picked it up. There was a number saved there, one he had not called in a very long time. His daughter. For years, the distance between them had been maintained not by circumstance, but by hesitation, by the quiet, persistent belief that too much time had passed, that the moment for reconciliation had somehow been missed. But now that belief no longer felt as certain as it once had. Arthur turned the phone over in his hand, then, with a steadiness that surprised even him, pressed the call button. The ringing sound filled the room, each tone carrying with it the weight of years unspoken. Benji did not move. He did not speak. He simply remained where he was, his presence steady, his silence supportive. Then, a voice. "Hello?" Arthur closed his eyes briefly. "Hi," he said, his voice quieter than usual, but clear. It's Dad." There was a pause, not long, but long enough, and in that pause something shifted, not just between them, but within him. For the first time in decades, Arthur Pendleton was no longer writing to the past. He was speaking into the present. The months that followed did not transform Arthur's life in any dramatic or immediate way, nor did they resolve every question or mend every fracture, but they introduced, gradually and with quiet persistence, a series of small changes that, taken together, altered the trajectory of his days in ways he had not anticipated. The call to his daughter had not been perfect. There had been hesitation, uncertainty, moments where words failed or arrived too late. But there had also been something else, a willingness, and that, Arthur came to understand, was enough to begin. Autumn gave way to winter, and winter, in its own slow and deliberate manner, softened into the early hints of spring, until, almost without noticing the exact moment of transition, Arthur found himself once again approaching the familiar date that had, for 40 years, marked a ritual he had never once broken. His birthday. The house, as always, was quiet that morning. The clocks were wound, the coffee brewed, the oak desk stood ready, the fountain pen resting where it had always rested, the stack of postcards waiting with the same patient expectation it had held for decades. Arthur sat down. He looked at the card. He picked up the pen. And then he stopped, not because he did not know what to write, but because, for the first time, He realized that what he had always written no longer felt sufficient. The conversation he had maintained for 40 years, structured, contained, directed toward a version of himself that existed only in reflection, had, in some subtle but undeniable way, reached its natural conclusion. Arthur set the pen down. He sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet rhythm of the clocks, the steady passage of time that no longer felt like something to be measured, but something to be engaged with. Then, slowly, he stood. He moved not toward the mailbox, but toward the hallway where his coat hung, where the familiar shape of his car keys waited. A different decision had already been made. The camera lay on the shelf in the living room. His old Leica, worn but carefully maintained, a tool not for recording time, but for capturing moments within it. Arthur picked it up. He checked the film, adjusted the lens, and then, without hesitation, he left the house. The drive felt different this time, not because the road had changed, but because he had. The same landscapes unfolded before him, the rolling hills, the quiet towns, the trees beginning once again to show the first signs of seasonal transformation, but they no longer carried the same weight of memory alone. Now they carried anticipation. Arthur did not stop at the diner. He did not pause to reconsider, because this journey was not about returning. It was about arriving. The porch of the house in Oak Creek, Vermont, held the quiet warmth of late afternoon, where the light stretched long across the wooden boards and settled gently into the spaces between things, illuminating not only what was present, but what had been. Arthur stood near the edge, his camera raised, his gaze focused not through memory, but through the lens. Eleanor stood in the garden, framed by the soft bloom of roses that had, against expectation, returned with renewed life, their colours rich, their presence quietly defiant against the passing of time. "Stay there," Arthur said, his voice carrying a calm certainty that felt both new and entirely natural. Eleanor smiled, adjusting her posture slightly, though not in a way that felt posed, but in a way that suggested comfort, familiarity, a willingness to be seen. Arthur pressed the shutter. The sound was soft, final, a moment captured, not for the past, not for reflection, but for something that had not yet fully taken shape. He lowered the camera. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Arthur walked toward her, the grass beneath his feet shifting gently, the air carrying the faint scent of earth and blossoms, of something growing, something continuing. "I didn't write the postcard," he said. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her expression curious but unsurprised. "No?" she asked. Arthur shook his head. "No," he said. "I thought it was time to try something different." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single postcard, not addressed to Oak Creek, not addressed to the past, but to Boston, to Benji. Eleanor's gaze softened. "And what did you write?" she asked. Arthur looked down at the card, then back at her. "Something I wish I had understood sooner," he said. He handed it to her. She read it silently, then smiled. Arthur stepped back slightly, his eyes moving once more across the house, the garden, the space that had once belonged entirely to memory, and now existed, fully and undeniably in the present. For 40 years he had written to a version of himself that could not answer. For 40 years he had believed that time moved only in one direction, carrying with it everything that could not be reclaimed. But now he understood something different. Not that time could be reversed, but that it could be met, answered, lived. Arthur looked at Eleanor. Then quietly he spoke the words that had, in one form or another, been waiting for him all along. Life begins, he said, when you decide to answer the letter. And this time he was no longer writing alone.